Hello and welcome to you all on this beautiful May Day. My name is Judith Hawley and I'm the chair for the second in our new programme in the London Luminaries series. If you're new to the London Luminaries, let me tell you that we represent a group of historic properties working together to explore the history of the West of London. It's the talk and the Luminaries provides a platform for them. We volunteer our time to organise, publicise and then edit the talks, which are all posted on our YouTube channel and our website shortly after the programme goes live. We usually have a theme for each season, but this year our partners are deciding what they want to showcase in their presentations. And this year we'll be running our second London Luminaries live event, this time at Orleans House Gallery. The date is the 28th May and it'll be an excellent chance to socialise with each other and speakers. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, let me remind you to put your questions into the chat at any point and I will raise them on your behalf at the end. And you can keep adding to the chat as the conversation proceeds between me and the speaker. Now, our speaker today, Nicola Moorby, is a curator of British art at the Tate, and we are extremely lucky to have her tonight. Not only is she the guest curator of the exhibition, Turner's Kingdom, Beauty, Birds and Beasts, which is currently on Turner's House, she's also very involved in many of the celebrations of Turner's 250th anniversary, and I hope she can tell us more about them later. Her new book, Turner and Constable, Art's Life Landscape, has been published by Yale University Press to coincide with the anniversaries of Turner and Constable. Over, Nicola.
Thank you very much indeed, and good evening to everybody. Thank you for joining me on this beautiful evening. It's absolutely my pleasure to be giving this talk to coincide with Turner's 250th anniversary, an occasion that we officially marked last week on the 23rd of April, which is the date traditionally accepted as the artist's birth date. And on that day, I was lucky enough to spend the day here, the most appropriate of venues, of course, Turner's House, Sandicombe Lodge in Twickenham. And we had an absolutely joyful day. We had drinks, we had birthday cake, we had biscuits with Turner's face on. And it was wonderful to be here, of all places, somewhere that the artist built for himself, which he loved, partly for the homely pleasures that it brought him. Central London was the office, but this is where Turner came to relax, to spend time with his father, to enjoy nature and its proximity to the River Thames, which makes it a particularly fitting venue for this year's exhibition, which is called Turner's Kingdom, Beauty, Birds and Beasts. And it's all about the birds and animals that feature within the artist's life and career and what they can tell us about the man himself. And where better to explore this theme than in the very place where Turner had a fish pond, where he kept a pony, and where he enjoyed the sights and sounds of the birds singing in his garden. Now, a particularly important part of the story that I wanted to tell within the exhibition is the work that Turner undertook for a particular patron during the same years that he owned Sandicombe Lodge. And that is this man, Walter Fawkes of Farnley Hall in Yorkshire. This is a portrait of him here. Now, I think today we would probably describe Fawkes as someone who is a thoroughly good egg. That's how he seems to me. He was a landowner who cared about agricultural improvement and the welfare of his tenants. And he was also a politician. He was an energetic campaigner for liberal reform. He stood politically with William Wilberforce on abolition, but he also had many intellectual interests, some of which are alluded to in this portrait of him by John Raphael Smith. Fawkes was an author and historian, and you can see writing implements and books on the desk behind him. But very prominently in the foreground here, we have a portfolio, and Fawkes was a significant collector and patron of British art in general, watercolour in particular, and most especially of all the name which you probably can't read, on the title of this portfolio, which is JMW Turner. And this was an association that benefited them both. It enriched and stimulated Turner's watercolour practice, definitely, in ways which are utterly unique. And so this is a relationship that's much more than just customer and supplier. It was built upon mutual liking and some shared interests. And so this is the subject of my talk this evening. What we might have found had we been able to rifle through this portfolio, and an exploration of the true friendship that inspired those contents. So in these two pencil portraits, we can see the two men much as they would have looked during this period of their friendship. There wasn't a huge difference in their ages. Walter Fawkes was 6 years older than Turner. But where there was a big gap was in their social standings, because Turner, of course, was from a relatively humble, low-income background. On his father's side, his relatives were hairdressers and barbers. On his mother's side, they were butchers. So socially, he was sort of just above the working classes, the labouring classes, but not by very much. Walter Fawkes, on the other hand, was from a very prominent Yorkshire family that had long been established in the area. He wasn't aristocracy, but the family was one with a long and distinguished lineage and history. And in 1792, he'd inherited one of the largest estates in England, the stately home of Farnley Hall, and its 20,000 acres of gardens, woodland, moorland, and agricultural land. So in the class-based hierarchies of the Georgian era, they would have seemed on the face of it to be quite unlikely bedfellows. But despite this, they formed a friendship that spanned over 2 decades, from around the beginning of the century right up until Fawkes's death in 1825. Now, for anyone who's got a fixed idea already about Turner, this might come as something of a surprise, because he's generally understood to be quite a curmudgeonly figure. He's got a reputation for being very commercially motivated, and also for keeping his private life private. But this is definitely an aspect of Turner's career where we do find crossover between his personal life and his professional existence. Turner was a really regular visitor to Farnley Hall. Between around 1809 and 1825, he visited most years at least once, and sometimes more. And these visits to Farnley were not, like the majority of Turner's travels, work trips. They were actually the nearest thing that he ever took to a holiday. He was received there as an honoured house guest. He was someone who was welcome to socialise with the family and to take part in the everyday life and activities of the estate. And we sense that Turner really relished these sojourns. He felt extremely comfortable there and at home. On occasions, of course, his visits did result in him being on the payroll, as it were, because during his lifetime, Walter Fawkes owned around 200 watercolours by Turner, more than any other collector during his lifetime. And although many of these were purchased on a sort of an ad hoc basis, Fawkes also commissioned Turner to make views of his house and estate, partly as a sort of a visual promotion of Fawkes's multifaceted interests and the central role that Farnley played within the area as a kind of a social and cultural hub. So this watercolour here depicts a view of Farnley Hall. It's up there on the hill, and it's taken from the confluence of the two rivers that meet in the valley to the southwest of the hall, the Wharfe and the Washburn. Now, actually, I say it's a watercolour, but actually what we can see here is a lovely example of the use of something called body colour, or also known as gouache, and that's a type of watercolour that's been modified so that it is no longer transparent, it is opaque, using larger grains of pigment or the addition of a filler such as chalk. And this represents a highly impactful option for creating additive whites it can be considered by purists to be a bit of a cheat's way out. But as you can see, it's very effective when used against a coloured ground. And Turner has employed it here to create a sense of the rippling energy of the water where those two rivers meet. And then over here on the left is our very first creature of the evening. It's a water bird of some description, and it's skimming over the surface of the river, almost like a sort of a dark punctuation mark of interest in the foreground of the composition. Now, the reason that I highlight this is that this kind of motif can often be found within Turner's painting. So here are two more instances. Both of these happen to be from 1842, so much later. On the left is a detail of Turner's famous watercolour, the Blue Rigi at sunrise, and on the right from an oil painting, Peace Burial at Sea. And on the one hand, you might sort of reasonably argue, well, so what? Turner was perhaps just including birds as a kind of a form of staffage to add a little bit of pictorial interest and movement. But there is an argument to be made that by inserting an avian presence within his paintings, Turner is using these birds as a kind of a symbolic artist's signature, particularly in landscapes that feature rivers, seas, or other bodies of water. One day I might sort of get around to counting them all up, but for now you'll have to take my word for it that there are enough of these that it questions whether it is a repetitive motif. So no doubt you'll be looking out, trying to spot these in any Turner paintings that you're looking at. But another concrete example is this lovely little cartoon in pen and ink that's found at the bottom of an autograph letter by Turner. It's not dated, but it's written to another artist, Augustus Wall Calcott, and you can see that beside where he's where he's signed his name, Turner has added this cartoon of a duck. And I think that's probably a humorous reference to his name, a play on words, Joseph Mallord William Turner. I think the Mallards were formerly the Mallards. And so this tells us immediately Turner has a sense of humour, but it also confirms the sense that I was alluding to, that he feels a certain affinity to waterfowl somehow. I do wonder whether this is not something to do with his physical appearance. A little bit like a duck, Turner was a small figure, not particularly elegant, and perhaps he had a sense of himself as being a sort of fairly ordinary looking kind of fellow in a world of art that's much more usually the preserve of more elevated individuals. Or maybe it's even got something to do with his affinity for painting water and the medium of watercolour. Whatever the reason, another very telling use of his language is that we find within his letters the phrase upon the wing or on the wing. He repeatedly uses this whenever he's about to leave London and head off on tour somewhere. He says, I'm on the wing. And I absolutely love this idea of Turner taking flight, because it suggests not just a physical freedom, but also an imaginative one. Nothing reinvigorates Turner's creativity more than his travel habit. And I've included here a quote from another letter. In 1809, Turner said that he was upon the wing to Yorkshire, and so he was off to see Walter Fawkes. Now, sometimes Turner used Fawkes's home of Farnley Hall just as a base for exploring other parts of Yorkshire, because much of his day-to-day life as a professional artist was spent producing work for the topographical print market. So Turner was commissioned to paint watercolours of recognisably picturesque views, and then these were then engraved and published in collectible series. And this kind of activity really required him to do the legwork. So he tramped all over the country with his sketchbooks, collecting the raw visual material, the detail that enabled him to produce this kind of rich portrait of place. And this is an example of one of those topographical watercolours. This is Weathercock Cave in Chapel-a-Dale, North Yorkshire. This is one of the sites that Turner showcased for a project called The History of Richmondshire. And Turner has depicted the cave half flooded. because the year that he happened to visit it was the notorious year without a summer in 1816. The previous year, a mighty volcanic eruption in Indonesia had created climactic implications that had actually reached as far as Europe. And even by British standards, the weather was really bad this year. And this prompted Turner to yet another duck reference. And whilst he was in Yorkshire, he wrote to a friend saying that he would be web-footed like a drake, thanks to the excessive rain that he was encountering. Now, on other occasions, I mentioned that maybe Turner's motivation for visiting Yorkshire was more about a change of scenery and some downtime. Although, having said that, Turner was never really off duty. His artist's eye was always sensitive to spectacle and imaginative possibilities. And according to Fawkes's son, the pleasingly named Hawksworth Fawkes, the stupendous weather effects in this particular oil painting exhibited in 1812 were inspired by a stay in Yorkshire when Turner witnessed a thunderstorm rolling in across the Yorkshire hills. And Turner took great delight in watching this and sketching it, and he immediately announced to the family that it would later provide the basis for a picture of the Carthaginian general Hannibal crossing the Alps. So this is a subject from ancient history. It also would have had contemporary resonance because of Napoleon's recent crossing of the Alps in 1800. And I think Turner, in his painting, has deliberately set up a compositional and maybe even a chromatic colour inversion of David's famous equestrian portrait of Napoleon that he would have seen in Paris in 1802. And that picture made explicit the link between Napoleon Bonaparte and Hannibal. But of course, where the French leader and his horse are imposing their dominance upon the landscape, Turner has thrown this in the other direction, and Hannibal and his horses and his armies are rendered in tiny ant-like proportions so that their actions seem insignificant and futile compared to the destructive power of nature. And of course, the really good joke here is that the largest land animal, the elephant, has been transferred to just a tiny little silhouette. I've had to zoom in on a detail here because otherwise you'd hardly be able to see it. And it's almost invisible. You perhaps wouldn't even notice, except your eye is drawn to it by these figures in the foreground who sort of echo the shapes of the waving trunk in the air with their upraised arms. Now, a nice feature today as a nod to the role that the area played in the evolution of Turner's painting. If you visit this part of the world, Otley today, you can find this chainsaw wood sculpture of an elephant and an artist's palette, and it's been created by a local artist, Shane Green. Now, you might think it's very unlikely to find such a foreign seeming animal in this part of the world, but actually this land was once used as an exotic game park instituted by Walter Fawkes, and it housed some very exotic species, boar and Indian deer and even zebra, so it's not all as unlikely as that. Now, returning to that earlier view that I showed you of Farnley Hall, I want to draw attention to another of Turner's major enjoyments at Farnley, and that was fishing. Turner absolutely loved fishing. It was one of his rare forms of relaxation. And also, I think for him, it was a sociable activity. It was a way for him to spend time and connect with other people, including, of course, men who were of a different social class to him. And fishing would have provided quite a levelling activity. It would have been comfortable, neutral territory where they could converse aside from any differences in upbringing and education. And in fact, Turner's fondness for fishing is one of the few biographical insights that we can be sure of when we're trying to diagnose things with regards to Turner's personality. So his first biographer, Walter Thornbury, used it as a way to intuit various character traits about Turner. So he said that because Turner fished, he must have been variously persevering, patient, indomitable, and had the quiet fortitude of a hero. And definitely one of the thrills of the exhibition at Turner's house is that I've been able to install Turner's actual fishing rod, which is on loan from the Royal Academy. Presumably, we're just reuniting it with the house. We must suppose that it was stored there before, and that's where it had its most use. Because Turner had a large fish pond constructed near the bottom of his garden at Sandycombe, and that's where he put catches from the River Thames as a kind of what's known as a stew pond, sort of an outdoor larder really for supplying fish suppers. But aside from that, there was also sheer enjoyment of the pursuit. Turner enjoyed being amid nature, and he loved to observe things always whenever he's out of doors. And certainly we sense his visual enjoyment in this study of various types of river fish, fish that he's presumably just caught either at Farnley or perhaps at Sandycombe. And these are identifiable as trout, tench and perch. And incidentally, this study can be currently seen on display at Tate Britain as part of a new display celebrating the near completion of the Turner Bequest cataloguing project, and I can highly recommend that little show. Now, fishing wasn't the only country pursuit on offer at Farnley, because Fawkes used his estate for a variety of outdoor leisure and sporting activities. And Turner tended to visit in late summer or early autumn, which was the shooting season. And Walter Fawkes hosted extensive shooting parties. Actually, they were such an event that they were often reported on in the local press, including details about who was there and how many birds they'd shot and so on. And this is a watercolour which is actually in the Wallace collection. But this depicts quite an exclusive gathering of individuals. It was painted not for Fawkes actually, but for somebody called Sir William Pilkington, who was a baronet from a nearby estate. But he was kind of part of Fawkes's wider family, because his niece was married to Fawkes's brother, bear with me. So that really demonstrates how useful it was to know Walter Fawkes, because not only was he collecting work himself, but he was also influential in introducing Turner to other networks, to people who were also keen to commission and buy from him. But what I find particularly fascinating about this watercolour is the social dimensions of the scene. In terms of the owner, Pilkington, and also by extension Walter Fawkes, their relationship with the landscape would have been governed by their social standing. And Turner has really emphasised the landowner's point of view. Fawkes is understood to be this man on the horse behind. I do have to smile somewhat. This is absolutely characteristic of the transparency of watercolour. I think Walter Fawkes in real life was quite a sturdy kind of figure, but he's a bit see-through here. But that's in sharp contrast to the way that Turner has layered the watercolour with gum arabic and used extensive what's called scratching out in order to create a sense of the very thick, dense, textured moorland foliage in the foreground. But we also have a sense of the vast distances of the estate receding into the background behind. So really, this enables the viewer to appreciate both the quality and the quantity of the land owned by Pilkington and Walter Fawkes. And in the foreground, we have a dog. This is a breed called a pointer, which is a canine almost exclusively owned by the upper classes at the time, so the aristocracy and the landowning gentry. They were bred specifically for hunting, and this one has all the bearing of a dog that's just scented its prey. It's frozen in an alert pose with its nose pointing towards the game. That's why it gets its name. And this explains why the man in the foreground here is striding in the same direction, ready for the bird to be flushed out of the undergrowth. And that man is generally understood to be J.M.W. Turner. And I do wonder if it's another flash of rather self-deprecating humour that Turner has actually signed his name in the bottom right-hand corner in what is essentially a patch of boggy ground. So Turner is kind of not only placed himself on foot, but he's saying that he very much knows where he belongs. Now, how good Turner actually was with a gun is anyone's guess. He did apparently succeed in shooting a cuckoo, at least on one occasion, although here, of course, the quarry is grouse. And there were many other game birds on the estate, including pheasant, guinea fowl, and woodcocks. And this link with shooting actually led to one of the most extraordinary uses of Turner's talents in Fawkes's service, and that was a series of 20 watercolours that he contributed for a particular project known as the Ornithological Collection, or the Farnley Book of Birds. Now, this was one of Fawkes's personal amateur undertakings. It was a personalised homemade version of Thomas Bewick's seminal publication, The History of British Birds. So it was made for the library at Farnley, and it was essentially a private family scrapbook. In 5 different volumes, Fawkes collected feathers from each of the featured species and then mounted them into albums alongside a watercolour illustration of the relevant bird. And 20 of these images were provided by Turner. So here are 3 of them, birds I've already mentioned, the woodcock, the cuckoo and the grouse. And I'm sorry to say they are studies which are highly likely to have been produced from dead species. Now, of course, this is an uncomfortable idea to us now, the idea that the pursuit of natural history went hand in hand with the direct hunting and killing of the subjects in question, but it is not a paradox that would have really troubled most members of Georgian society. Now, Turner was not the only artist to provide these bird drawings. Fawkes got his family involved. He asked friends and people who worked on the estate to also contribute illustrations. Not all of them have even been identified. But of course, it's a particular coup to have contributions from J.M.W. Turner, Royal Academician and Premier Watercolour Specialist of the day. And these studies really speak to Turner's ability to adopt the language and iconography of any particular branch of visual culture. You can see from these examples that I'm showing you that they're extremely beautiful. They're highly detailed, quite different from what we often think of as Turner's being sort of usual loose, hazy style. And they sit somewhere between conventional natural history illustrations and something I think a bit more evocative. So I love the way how Turner has portrayed here the male cock pheasant on the right and the female hen pheasant on the left looking towards each other, almost like the conventions of marriage portraiture in the history of Western art. I also honestly don't think Turner would have done this kind of work for anyone else. And just to illustrate that, I'll give you an example. Turner's biographer, Thornbury, who is notoriously unreliable, but he recorded an incident where a lady asked Turner to make a drawing of her spaniel, her pet. And Turner turned to her in astonishment and said, "My dear madam, you do not know what you ask." So implying really that that kind of work is so far beneath him that he just absolutely would never consider it. So that puts the Farnley project into some kind of context. The fact that Turner was prepared to take on something so frankly menial as illustrations for a family scrapbook is a measure of the high regard in which he held Walter Fawkes and his interest and collaboration with the creative activities that were taking place and were generated by Fawkes at Farnley. Now, all of the birds are exquisite, but I'm going to end the talk with 2 of my favourites from the series, both of which are included in the exhibition at Turner's House. We actually have 5 of the birds come down from their usual home in Leeds. So first of all, is this one, the heron, which I think is possibly my favourite. It's absolutely full of life and character. I love the way that Turner has varied his brushstrokes to describe the different kinds of plumage of the species. I love the heron's beady eye. And I also like the way that Turner has depicted the heron very alert, having just caught a fish. I think that's definitely a nod, really, of respect to nature's most skilled fishermen from one angler to another. And then the last one I want to show you is the peacock. Now, is this not the most magnificent study? And I promise you, reproduction doesn't do it justice. So please go to the house to see it if you possibly can. Turner actually had included a peacock symbolically in an assembly of artistic references in the frontispiece to this plate from his celebrated didactic print series, the Liber Studiorum, which really was a manifesto, a visual manifesto about the intellectual power and versatility of landscape. And in my book, Turner and Constable, I describe this as like looking into the lumber room of Turner's mind. It's an assembly of all the different strands of theory and cultural thought and history that he weaves into his landscapes. And peacocks were often used by artists as symbols of wealth or beauty, or even the sun, which is of course pertinent to Turner. The way the tail opens up is akin to the rays of the sun. They'd also long been part, of course, of the visual culture of stately homes, and they were certainly an ornamental feature roaming the gardens at Farnley Hall. But a little mystery is, could they also be found at Sandicombe Lodge? Because unlikely as this might seem for such a humble dwelling, the 1814 watercolour of the house by William Havell actually features a peacock and a peahen strutting around the garden. So it begs the question, were these birds ever really there? Or have they just been included by William Havell as a kind of fanciful embellishment? Maybe they were trying to make Turner's rather modest villa look a little bit more grand. Or maybe they'd wandered in from a nearby estate. Or perhaps they were meant to act as a reference to the artistic owner of Sandicombe Lodge. I've heard Catherine Parry Wingfield plausibly suggest that they could actually be a nod to Turner's friendship with Walter Fawkes, because there is some crossover between the two places. Turner is also, as well as designing his own house, he's supposed to have been the architect to a gatehouse at Farnley Hall. So this is perhaps included here to reference that friendship. But the very odd thing is that when this plate was engraved for the Thames Views, published the same year, the peacocks mysteriously disappear. So perhaps it's not something we'll ever know the answer to. I hope you can see on the screen in the reproduction that Turner has actually signed his name on the peacock. He scratched it into the bird's neck, and that's usually something he only bothers to do if the work is likely to be on public display. And actually it appears that the peacock featured amongst the curated selection of watercolours chosen by Walter Fawkes for his 1819 exhibition that was staged in his London home, 45 Grosvenor Place. Most of the works on display were landscapes, but more importantly, all of them were watercolours, which was a really unusual thing to do at this time. Very uncommon for a patron with money and taste to place an exclusive collecting emphasis on contemporary watercolourists. And the exhibition was a revelation to press and public alike. It resulted in a surge of positive publicity that placed Turner firmly at the head of this exciting modern cultural moment. And rather touchingly, in the catalogue for the exhibition, Walter Fawkes made this very public dedication to Turner, saying, "To you, I dedicate it first as an act of duty, and secondly as an offering of friendship. For be assured, I can never look at it," he means the catalogue, "without intensely feeling the delight I've experienced during the greater part of my life from the exercise of your talent and the pleasure of your society. So from Fawkes's exhibition 200 years ago to the large number of exhibitions that are happening all over the country in celebration of Turner 250 this year. And we can perhaps talk about some of these, but I would be remiss not to leave you with an encouragement to visit Turner's house and see Turner's Kingdom, Beauty, Birds and Beasts, which is on until the 26th of October this year. If there are any questions, I am, of course, very happy to try and answer them, but thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Nicola. And before we go over to the Q&A, and we've got a few questions in there already, and before I thank our talk, I just want to advertise to you our next speaker, who will be the wonderful Clive Francis, who will be talking about Greg's Temple, and that will be on the 1st of July. We take a break for June. So let's go now to the questions. Nicola, do stop sharing, and we'll be able to see your face more fully. There's some good questions already, and some of them are to do with the class angles that you've brought out, and Turner's status, his background, his relation to Fawkes. And one of our audience asks whether Fawkes would have had a Yorkshire accent, and whether he would have felt maybe, I mean, I think the implication here is that maybe Turner and Fawkes both felt like outsiders in polite society. Is there a connection there, do you think?
I think it's certainly fair to say that Fawkes would have had a Yorkshire accent. You know, he really prided himself on his connections to the area. And there is the argument, which has been made very beautifully by Lucy Bailey, who's written a PhD on this subject, that a lot of Turner's work specifically about the house and the fact that Walter Fawkes brought them to London was really to advertise Yorkshire as a region within the capital, and saying that it was, you know, historically and culturally important, both in the past but also in recent events, and that was sort of part of his political interests about reform. And yeah, he was a very strong advocate for the region. It's possible that maybe because he didn't have a refined upper class accent, that Turner did feel comfortable. As we know, Turner spoke with a Cockney accent. He didn't lose that all his life. I'm not sure Walter Fawkes would have felt like an outsider necessarily. I mean, we know that he was very active in communicating with politicians, but also people like Thomas Bewick. You know, they corresponded. And, you know, he would have had a high level of education. So perhaps not quite as difficult for him to connect with lots of different people as perhaps it might have been for Turner, who we know was on the receiving end of some social prejudice, particularly in the early years of the Royal Academy.
Yeah, and there's some questions about Turner, but I want to follow up some more about Fawkes. It'd be quite wrong to paint Yorkshire as a sort of a backwater, as a place without culture, when it has assembly rooms and, you know, all that's going on in York and Scarborough, and all sorts of amazing things going on in that county in that period. You mentioned Fawkes's politics. Did he have any connection with that other famous guy, or Guido Fawkes?
I think there was a distant connection, yes, although presumably not one that he particularly was all that keen to trumpet. But the historical figure that he was actually very keen to promote was Sir Thomas Fairfax, who was a direct antecedent, who was a hero of the English Civil War, and actually another of Turner's projects for Walter Fawkes was illustrating his collection of what he called Fairfaxiana, some really extraordinary artifacts from the Civil War, including things like a chair and I think a sort of a helmet and a shield and so on. And they were painted by Turner. And then Fawkes displayed them in his house, in the old part of the house, in what was the dining room, as a sort of an immersive historical experience when you were dining. And presumably the watercolours would have enabled him to show those to people in London, for example, and he would have been able to carry them with him.
fascinating connection. And there's one quite long, complicated question, so I'm going to read it out to you. And it begins with a tribute, I think a plug that I would certainly endorse. So one of our audience members thanks you very much for the fascinating talk. It does reveal some little known aspects of Turner's practice if we're used perhaps to seeing the huge the huge oil paintings in places like the Tate. And she highly recommends the exhibition, and especially the ornithological pictures that are rarely shown now that outside Leeds. Now, here's the question. Can Nicola say more about the portrait of Walter Fawkes of John Raphael Smith? Turner worked Smith's engraving studio in Covent Garden when he was a young man. Could he have introduced Smith to Fawkes? Sorry, did Smith introduce? So which way around is it? Yeah. So as Turner knew Smith, could Turner have introduced Smith to Fawkes, and then Smith did?
I must admit that I don't know. It's entirely possible that John Raphael Smith knew Walter Fawkes in advance of Turner or aside from Turner, because Turner wasn't his only connection in the London art world. He collected a number of other artists, and he was well known in artistic circles as a generous patron and as somebody who was keen to promote the art. So it's possible that connection came about separately, but honestly, I don't know.
So we're thinking really of a sort of a wider network rather than sort of very just limited straight lines. But
absolutely, yeah. So in his collection, he collected some of the big names of what we often refer to as the golden age of British watercolor. People like Joshua Crystal, Samuel Prout, John Varley. These are names that are sort of quite familiar if you know that moment in British art history. But of course, Turner is by far and away the headline act.
And the original questioner has added that Smith and Fawkes were both engaged in radical politics. So
okay, well then that's absolutely this. Perhaps a suggestion that they knew each other aside from Turner. It may have been that brought them together anyway. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful stuff. And I want to go back to an earlier question about Turner, which is an indication of his class and also his really touching relationship with his father, with Old Dad. So Old Dad was a wig maker, wasn't he? Is it possible that he might have actually fashioned the flies on Turner's fishhooks? I know often anglers like to make their own flies. It's a very personal thing.
Yeah.
Thinking of the wig maker's skill with material.
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess it is entirely possible. Certainly Turner's rod is a one for fly fishing. So yeah, I guess that is possible. He certainly did all sorts of other things for Turner. He was his studio assistant. He ground up his paints. He set his palette. He purchased his materials. And also at Sandycombe, we know that it was Old Dad who did the gardening and did the cooking. So yeah, absolutely, why not?
And poor Turner really sort of went downhill, didn't he, after the death of his father, and became quite withdrawn and increasingly sort of melancholy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think his father arguably was the person he loved most in his life. And again, it's we often don't know a great deal about what Turner was feeling at any given moment. He's not someone who shares that with us. This is something I draw out in my book, is that compared to John Constable, who tells us everything all the time, and his letters run to sort of several extensive volumes, we're really, in the dark, scrabbling around with fragments for Turner. But he does write this letter after his father dies, where he really expresses his grief very profoundly. And I think it also brings in an awareness of his own mortality, because it's also around this time he begins to think about his legacy and how he's going to secure that for the future. And part of that, of course, is the Turner bequest, which is now, housed at Tate Britain, but forms one of the reasons why Turner is the nation's favourite and arguably the greatest British artist.
I want to pick up on something you said about the bequest, if I may. You talked about the bequest cataloguing being complete, and it's my understanding that he wanted everything to be together in a sort of was partly egotistical, but also perhaps pedagogical way. But it is much more scattered than he'd intended, isn't it? So there's some bits at Tate Britain, but we've got those beautiful birds at Leeds, and you mentioned other places where some of the images.
So first of all, we don't really, again, know what Turner intended fully, because his will is an extremely confusing document, and there's lots of edits and addendums and codicils. He certainly intended to leave his finished oil paintings to the nation, to the point where he even bought some of them back in order to make sure that they were, a self-curated collection, and he wanted a gallery to be built to keep them together. It's not clear what he intended with everything else that was left in his studio. And, certainly some of the personal nature of the sketchbooks, there is an argument to be made that he'd be absolutely horrified to know that we were cataloguing every page. But the bequest was everything left in Turner's studio when he died. So it doesn't include things that left for sale elsewhere. So the Farnley birds were in Walter Fawkes' collection, so not part of the Turner bequest. And most of it is housed at Tate Britain. There's a very small cherry-picked selection in the National Gallery, and there's also a few paintings which are left in situ in places like Petworth House.
Yeah.
But otherwise, 37,000 items are at Tate Britain. And that includes oil paintings, watercolours, and around 300 sketchbooks. And is that which is coming to completion for the cataloguing project, which has been an update of the last time it was catalogued, which was in 1909. So obviously a huge amount of research has been done on Turner in the intervening period. And it's gone into the bequest in kind of granular depth, making connections that have never previously been made. And it's all available online. So it's the most astonishing resource.
That is going to be absolutely amazing. I want to ask you a bit more about the what we can see at the wonderful exhibition in Sandringham Lodge. But I was thinking about Turner's interest in collecting and cataloguing, and you've got that the wonderful contributions to the sort of extra illustrated scrapbook, the Fawkes bird book. But I was also wondering, I've never looked at it myself, I must admit, but I've read about it, the Liber Studiorum. You talked about the lumber room of his mind, his odd ideas and theories. Is it in any way a guidebook? I mean, I'm thinking about how, say, Hogarth wrote treatises. I mean, he used his illustrations, but he was really trying to teach people a fairly coherent theory. Is Turner a didactic artist?
Yeah, it's probably the most explicit didactic statement that he makes. And it's interesting that he chooses to do that visually rather than in a text-based document. And there are a number of reasons for that, but really the model that he was working upon was another print series called the Liber Veritatis, which was from Claude Lorraine, an artist whom Turner revered and really held up as somebody who'd foregrounded landscape in its own right. But the whole point of the Liber Studiorum, which means book of studies in Latin, and nothing says scholarly intent better than giving it a Latin title in the first place, was to show that landscape could be used to equal and to provide the same intellectual depth and variety of any of the what was at the time more revered genres of art at the Royal Academy. So the kind of top of the pops in the hierarchy was history painting, and genre pictures, which are scenes of everyday life in the Dutch tradition, and the more sort of elevated forms of landscape, classical landscapes and pastoral landscapes, which are tapping into literary ideas. And so really Turner categorized all these different kinds of landscape and then set out to prove that it could do all the things that its detractors at the Royal Academy were saying that it couldn't, because really landscape was just seen as a fairly not a very intellectual pursuit, because you were just painting what was there rather than having the imaginative content. And Turner is really disproving that.
And it's often associated with amateurs and lady watercolorists. And yeah. Yeah, and to think about what he was doing with landscape, and to pick up some of you had some beautiful descriptions of his techniques, especially the hunting scene with the treatment of the foreground and the background. So there's a way in which he's really pushing the properties of watercolor, do something quite unusual that seems to me to be forcing the viewer to think differently about space, depth on the page.
Definitely. I mean, I would say that really Turner at heart was a watercolorist, and he needed to paint oils in order to be able to compete in an academic sense, but actually his heart lay with watercolor. And what he does is to change it from what is really quite a craft-based artisanal activity into a fully fledged mode of cultural expression suitable for exhibition at the highest levels. Really, he's pitching it to compete with oil painting. And one of the ways that he does that is to bring about a whole host of new ways of applying the paint. So nobody teaches him how to do these things. He's really coming up with them, sometimes because he's looking and he's responding directly to natural effects and how best to make that work atmospherically in the paint. At other times, he's just, very, very experimental. He's trying out new products and being very innovative with the way that he combines different ingredients in the watercolor and different types of paper. And this is something that we're able to chart through the Turner bequest, because we have the kind of behind the scenes work from Turner Studio all through his life. We see this incredible mission and commitment to the media that lasts his whole life. And, even today, really, he is a very daunting standard of technical wizardry with watercolor that, possibly no one has surpassed.
Yeah, and there's a really good question that's just come up. I just wanted to tie off that thought a bit, and then I'm going to pick you up on some about the watercolors in a moment. And some of his oil paintings, in a way, are using watercolor techniques, and he's transparent glazes rather than he's using impasto.
Absolutely. That's a very astute point. Usually the two media require completely different ways of working. And Turner not only makes his watercolors look like oil paintings, but he tries to make his oils look like watercolors with that very watery, lucid coloring, the transparent, pure colors on a white background is something you get from watercolor, but Turner does that with his canvases. And the way that the forms appear to kind of dissolve. So there is that argument that it's the watercolor practice informing what then happens with the oils.
Yeah, that's lovely. And there's a really lovely question here from one of the audience. Did Turner have a painting where he thought he'd achieved his maximum potential?
Well, I mean, this is the thing, we don't really know. I think probably if there was one work, it would be the Fighting Temeraire, because that's the painting that Turner called his darling, and that he would not sell, even though he was offered an astronomical figure for it, £5,000, which is, a vast amount of money. So he obviously intended to leave it to the nation. And it was probably the one, particularly in the later part of his career, where he faced heavy criticism from the press and the critics and the public. He was sort of beginning to alienate what public expectations of art were. That was the one that was almost sort of universally well received, because for many of the reasons that we still love it today, it's visually quite easy to understand, even though it's a very complex picture. It captures a really powerful sense of nation and a kind of pride, but also is quite ambivalent in the message it gives us between the passing of ages, the inevitability of one age giving way to another. So possibly that's the one that he might settle on. But because he doesn't tell us, we can only try and speculate.
Yes. And it's so interesting, isn't it, that, as you say, it's one of the most popular ones, and that's not always the case with what endures and what gets passed down the ages compared to what the original artist might want.
Yes, I mean, again, that's a nice comparison I make with John Constable, because of course it's the Hay Wain and possibly the cornfield, which has given us that very strong kind of brand trademark Constable. But actually the work that he thought was his greatest was his late painting of Salisbury Cathedral, which is actually much more Turnerian in its outlook. It's very symbolic, it's very dramatic. And that one wasn't purchased for the nation and almost disappeared from view. So it's given us a skewed perspective on Constable.
And such a good link there. We're really looking forward to reading your book. I'm going to pick up on symbols. So you mentioned the symbolic nature of Salisbury Cathedral thing, and you talked about the birds as metaphors or symbols, and I love the idea that might be a pun on his name, that Mallard. I wondered also about whether, so is there a connection between his use of possible symbolism in the watercolors and his desire to elevate the status of a landscape, a watercolor landscape? Is he introducing things which you might find in a Lorraine landscape or in a history painting or something like that? Because the presence of animals, birds as symbol sort of obliges you to read the landscape in a different way, other than just thinking this is beautifully picturesque with this clump of trees and these cows or whatever it is. But is it asking you to respond and interpret it in a slightly different way?
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I think Turner doesn't limit his watercolor practice, so he brings to it all of the sophistication that he's putting into his large oil paintings, in terms of, you know, the fact that he manages to capture a sense of scale, panorama, drama, sublime, dramatic shipwrecks, for example. Even when Turner does them in watercolor, they deliver all of that same power and emotion, so that whether you're buying Turner's work as an oil painting or whether you're buying it for just a few shillings as a reproductive engraving after his work, you're still getting all of that, you know, high level visual language, which, you know, tells you that you're buying the work of, you know, the greatest, one of the greatest Royal Academicians and landscape specialists. And he certainly does include a kind of vocabulary that people would recognize. So the Claudian kind of visual language is something that he does put into local scenes around the country. He sort of presents them in this golden light, almost like a classical harbour scene.
That sort of, that sort of idea, sort of the borrowed landscape or the borrowed light, where you sometimes, you know, Dutch painters who went to Italy and then they bring back Italian skies to put over sort of Dutch poppy fields and so on.
He's just sort of, I mean, I suppose a modern term would be he's giving them a glow up, a sort of a facelift, a makeover.
Yeah. Can you tell us a bit more about which of these images we might see at Sandringham Lodge? Obviously, the magnificent peacock.
That's right.
What else might we see in your
so exhibition? From the Farnley Book of Birds, we have the peacock and the heron. I tried to choose birds that were particularly pertinent to either Turner's biography or to Sandringham itself. So the heron is a bird that you still regularly see on the River Thames by Richmond. There is also a barn owl, which is absolutely beautiful. It's just, it is like a portrait of a person. It's so full of personality. There's also a peacock, sorry, not peacock, a turkey, which I have to say I had no intention of choosing to begin with until I saw it, and it's such a knockout work, but turkeys are so odd looking. And there is a goldfinch, which of course is a regular garden bird that we see. And then there are other loans which are from the Turner bequest in Tate. So there's a beautiful study of a teal, a duck, for the reasons which I've outlined before, which is quite similar to the Farnley birds. Then there's a group of studies which are very, very different, which relate to another of Turner's friendships and patronage with Lord Egremont at Petworth House. And these things, rather than being done for a client, would seem to have just been done for Turner's own pleasure. Again, records of life on the estate, and particularly the ones I've chosen are the animal inhabitants, but they're sort of barely there in terms of brushstrokes. They're just very, very quickly done, very bold, and yet they capture such vitality and life, but they present a nice juxtaposition. In terms of other animals that you'll see there, there's a cat cupboard. You'll know the room is not a big exhibition room, but there's a little cupboard, and in it is a very early study of a cat, which possibly might have been in Turner's house in Maiden Lane. We certainly know there were lots of cats in Turner's studio by the end of his life, and they roamed all over this rather dilapidated, presumably it must have smelt pretty dreadful as well, rather kind of Dickensian conditions Turner lived in. And the cats would jump out and scare people. And I've also included a reproduction of some of the paw prints of these cats that you can still find on watercolours in the Turner bequest.
So the cats are painting. I like to think of cats actually contributing to the artwork.
Absolutely, they had artistic aspirations.
Cats are clearly clever
themselves.
enough to,
yeah.
Oh,
and the final watercolor from the Tate is a really late study of fish, which is obviously nice to juxtapose with the fishing rod, but it's a very peculiar thing. It comes from a sketchbook where the rest of the book are imaginative studies of whaling scenes. And the fish are John Dory, which are quite an odd looking species. And they seem to be a jumping off point for some fantastical monsters and sea creatures that appear in some of those very powerful late marine subjects. So quite a variety of different encounters with creatures.
What a wonderful collection that you've brought together. That's all there in Turner, but you're allowing us to see this sort of special view, this kind of unique insight. And I'd really encourage people to go to the exhibition and to visit the house, because you talked about, and sort of the closing remarks really, because people need to go and have their Chitonic. Not really knowing what Turner felt a lot of the time, but in some ways being in the house and seeing his works, you get a clear sense, or a sense anyway, of what's going on in Turner's mind, what he wants, what he's sort of yearning for. So I strongly recommend that you go to that exhibition. And if you want more insights into Turner and his friendship with another great collector and also fisherman, Sir John Soane, you'll find other talks on our series, on our YouTube channel and our website. And I want to hear an amusing but distressing anecdote about pike in Turner's stew pond, also search back through our previous talks from Turner's house. And I really want to thank Nicola most warmly for this really insightful, fascinating talk. And I know there's been a lot of enjoyment from the audience. There's been some lovely comments. It's always good to see both new people and our old favourites there joining in. So I'll end by thanking from all of us for this excellent talk, and encouraging people who are here tonight to go and see the exhibition in person. It's unmissable. Thank you so much.
Thank you.